An exclusive interview with Alec Murdaugh's lead attorney, Dick Harpootlian. A stand-your-ground shooting in Horry County that has led to allegations of law enforcement corruption. Another unexplained death tied to the saga of Micah Miller. An upstate sheriff at the focus of an escalating federal investigation, and a chaotic ending to South Carolina's legislative session. And that's just some of the stuff we covered this week, folks. I'm Will Folks, the owner and founding editor of FITSNews.com. Welcome to another edition of Your Week in Review. Let's dive in. All right, folks, we have a sprawling true crime block to start our show off with this week. And we're going to begin with an extended interview that I had this week with legendary South Carolina attorney and the lead lawyer for notorious convicted criminal Alec Murdaugh. Dick Harpootlian and I sat down, and I'm joined by Jen Wood. Jen, the crazy thing about this interview, Dick and I talked for an hour before we even got to the Murdaughs, which I think just tells you the number of stories this guy has. Just a reservoir of political, true crime history here in the Palmetto State. But I do want to talk a little bit before we get to the Murdaugh updates, because we did, again, eventually discuss the Murdaugh case. But leading up to it, we talked extensively about the focus of his new book, Dig Me a Grave. And I'm referring, of course, to Pee Wee Gaskins, the serial killer, 14 known victims, perhaps many more. But Jen, this is a infamous killer executed back in 1991 here in South Carolina via the electric chair, who was, again, the focus of Dick Harpootlian's book. It was Dick Harpootlian who put him on death row as a prosecutor. And so an interesting kind of twist there. In the Murdaugh case, we know him as a defense attorney, but in the Gaskins case, he was the prosecutor. Jen, you read this book like I did. It's coming out very soon, available for pre-order. We'll put that QR code up here so folks can go ahead and grab it. But just a gripping and dark tale, Jen. As you read that book, tell me some of the things that went through your mind as you were going through that narrative about the story of Pee Wee Gaskins.
Pee Wee Gaskins has always fascinated me as an individual, as a killer. His case has fascinated me. And there isn't a ton of, there haven't been a ton of documentaries. There are a few. There haven't been a lot of books beyond his biography, which, you have to take that with a grain of salt. So I was really excited when I learned that Dick was writing about this case because, between him and Jack Swerling, nobody knows this case better. And they knew Pee Wee personally. So it was a great read. I've read it twice now, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed Dick's perspective on the case. And it is very, very dark. I mean, just, you say it in the interview, the opening scene where, kills a mother and their child. It's very, very dark, but I think it's done respectfully.
Yeah, and the other thing I found just enthralling about this book was the way that it interwove the story of Pee Wee Gaskins with sort of the evolution of the justice system in South Carolina, and some of the descriptions that Harpootlian provided of that system when he was first breaking into it half a century ago. It's just, I mean, again, we still have a good old boy problem in South Carolina, don't get me wrong, but at least now there is some means of accountability. And he talked about that again at length in our interview about how there is more accountability now. I actually gave FITSNews a little bit of a shout out for our role in that, but I wanted to keep it focused on the story. And Jim, we've got a clip here where he discusses some of what you were just referencing, Pee Wee Gaskins claiming that connection with Attorney Harpootlian. Let's take a listen to that section.
I mean, think about that guy. He drowns a pregnant woman because she's one of his former girlfriends, because she's pregnant by a black man, and then takes a hammer to the 2-year-old child and beats it to death. A 2-year-old child with a hammer. I mean, what kind of monster does that? And then, as I began getting involved in this case and was with Gaskins in court, he was engaging, he was affable, he had a sense of humor. And during this death penalty case, there's an episode in the book where he and I are sitting in the courtroom over a lunch break, I'm working to get ready for the next witness, and he's sitting 20 feet away from me with 2 guards, and in his high-pitched voice, first of all, I don't think I've ever had any defendant call me by my first name. But he says, Dick, Dick, and I wasn't offended by it because he'd been calling me Dick we'd been there 4 weeks. And so it wasn't, whenever he saw me, hey, Dick, how you doing? Or smile at me or wave. Very friendly. I said, what do you want, Pee Wee? He said, you're a lot like me. I said, what are you talking about? I said, you like killing. Okay. He said, I like killing. You like killing. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, you like killing me? You're enjoying this. And I said, no. And we went on to explain I was seeking justice. But the fact that he thought we were kindred spirits, that I like killing like he liked killing. And remember the baby? And he liked doing that. He liked it. His racist tendencies dominated Tyner, black. Pee Wee was the first white man executed for killing an African American in the history of the state. So part of what prompted him to kill Tyner was not just this vengeance for Tony Simo, whose parents were killed by Tyner, but he could kill a black guy too. It was a win-win for him.
So Dick's book, Dig Me a Grave, about Pee Wee Gaskins, you can, again, pre-order it right now on that QR code. We really appreciate him taking the time, but obviously I wasn't going to let a conversation with Dick Harpootlian go without discussing the status of Alec Murdaugh's appeal. And Jen, this is something we have talked about extensively on this show. Most of the folks we speak with, most of the online polls, most common sense constitutional scholars all agree Alec Murdaugh exceedingly likely to get a new trial, if not at the state level, certainly at the federal level. But I was struck in this interview by how confident Dick Harpootlian is that the state Supreme Court is going to give Alec Murdaugh a new trial. Jen, what were your thoughts on how bullish he was on that?
That surprised me too, because when people ask me, I've never been overly confident that Alex would get it at the state level. I am not overly confident at that. So his confidence struck me in his belief in new Chief Justice Kittredge, his ability to handle a case and look at the facts was, I think, interesting. I do think Alex Murdaugh deserves a new trial, 100%.
Well, let's take a listen to that exchange where I asked Dick Harpootlian about why he's so bullish on the state Supreme Court granting Alec Murdaugh a new trial. Here's that clip.
Well, if we get a new trial, you'll hear all about it.
Well, let's talk about that process, because a little over a year ago, in the Richland County Courthouse, just down the street from where we're filming this, there was an evidentiary hearing about allegations of jury tampering involving the clerk of court down there in Colleton County, the former clerk of court. She's resigned in disgrace, most would agree, who allegedly tampered with the jury in this trial. At that hearing, one juror went on the record and stated that not only was there tampering, but it influenced her decision.
Correct.
4 others affirmed that there was tampering.
Correct.
Let me ask you this. Why the hell was that not game, set, match? And why was a new trial not ordered that day?
Well, you'd have to ask Justice Toll, but that's part of the appeal. We believe that there's a federal case directly on point. There's no state case that supports Judge Toll's position. We believe, and we've put in our brief, that she misinterpreted a decision from Judge Kittredge. It didn't say what she said it said. But the South Carolina Supreme Court will have an opportunity, we hope, by the end of this year, to hear argument on that and correct what we believe was a mistake.
What do you think the chances are there? There's so much discussion about, it's 50-50,
if you look at the federal case, what are our chances at the state level? That's not the only issue in the appeal. We talked about the cell phone being thrown out and the expert they qualified, who we believe should not have been qualified. if that evidence were not contradicted, but if their expert was knocked out, that's enough to give us a new trial.
It blows their whole timeline out of the water.
Correct. And there are a number of other issues like that. The 2.5 weeks of financial crimes before we ever got to the murder, the forensics and all of that. So I think, I can't give you, we should get a new trial.
From the Supreme Court.
From the Supreme Court, we believe. They may have a different view of the law than I do, or that the federal courts do. If they deny that, then we'll be going to federal court on a habeas to give the federal court a chance to apply the federal standard.
Were odds for Alec Murdaugh at the state level or the federal level, which would you say?
I believe this Supreme Court is going to give us a new trial.
Really?
I think this is one of the best Supreme Courts we've had in my 50 years of practicing law.
Now, there are those who say that the Supreme Court wants this to go away. They believe this has been a stain on the legal profession, that a lot of your allies in the trial lawyer lobby want to kind of get back to business, that this has been an inhibitor. After all, Alec Murdaugh is not just the scion of this powerful family that I mentioned. He was the leader of the South Carolina trial lawyer lobby for a very long time. So This is a guy who literally led the organization that is representing the trial lawyer lobby. Very powerful.
That's about money. This is about justice. And again, based on the forensic evidence, I don't believe Alec Murdaugh killed Paul and Maggie. And again, I had an opportunity to watch them for a year, watch the chemistry, watch the interaction. There was never indication. And by the way, the government, the state's theory, their motive is that he thought he was going to be discovered because of some transaction, 2:00 in the afternoon, and decides to distract by executing Maggie and Paul. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard in my life. But the jury, you didn't have to sell the jury on that, because after 2.5 weeks of him stealing money from, widows and orphans and mentally deficient and quadriplegics, you never got to that. Is the forensic evidence sufficient or not? So, it was a good strategy by the government, but I think an illegal one.
Well, Jim, we talked about this, and I want to ask you about this because the judicial system here in South Carolina, the trial lawyer lobby, they want to get back to business as usual. They want this story to be over. People have made their money. They've exposed the, quote, bad apple. They now want to get back to the business that they were in before this happened, which was, quite frankly, doing stuff that kind of ran up pretty close to some of the things that the Murdaugh empire was doing. And so that's why I've always said that I'm skeptical of the state of South Carolina granting him a new trial, because that's just going to extend this narrative of institutional corruption. And frankly, it's going to amplify that narrative, because it will demonstrate, Jen, that there was corruption in the trial itself. You got this corrupt empire. You can't even get a fair trial here in South Carolina. It just, again, an embarrassment.
It does, but the jury tampering aspect is not the only part of their appeal, and people forget that, because that is the most public part of the appeal. But there are a lot of very, very good arguments that have absolutely nothing to do with the jury tampering. The evidence, the experts that testified. There are aspects of that appeal that I think, beyond the jury tampering, are grounds for a new trial.
Jen, I would love to dissect this story, and I, again, could listen to Dick Harpootlian for hours. I hope he writes a lot of books. I hope we get to talk to him in the future about those books. Like I said, a limitless reservoir of stories, but we got a lot to cover in this true crime block. I want to move on now to a case that you have been intimately involved in, and that is the story of Scott Spivey. Jen, walk us through Scott Spivey. Walk us through the shooting in September that claimed his life, September 2023. Give us an update on that case, on that horribly botched investigation. Tell us a little bit about this story and why we're here talking about it.
Right. So Scott Spivey, 33-year-old man in Horry County, who was shot dead on September 9th, 2023, during a roadside confrontation. So the two shooters involved are Weldon Boyd and his friend Bradley, and they are claiming self-defense under South Carolina's Stand Your Ground law. South Carolina has one of the most, the strongest Stand Your Ground laws in the country. So the initial investigation was handled by the Horry County Police Department. And
Jen, let's be clear here. It was mishandled.
Yeah,
it was
yes,
mishandled by the Horry County Police Department. Please proceed.
100%.
Please proceed.
And it's interesting because the next case we're going to talk about is another Horry County investigation. So we'll get into that. But yeah, it was mishandled by the Horry County Police Department, and the investigators determined that the shooting was justified, and then Scott's family obviously very upset by their findings, just started digging into it, looking for more information. And Valerie Barline of the Wall Street Journal did this wonderful article expose about the findings. The Spivey family ended up filing a wrongful death lawsuit against Weldon Boyd, and that was primarily what her story was about, was this wrongful death lawsuit. They want this investigation reopened by SLED. They want the findings reviewed by the Attorney General. And, in the aftermath, we've had so far 2 Horry County officers fired. SLED is investigating them for misconduct. There have been at least 3 other officers disciplined by the new chief of police, Chris Leonhardt, for their actions in this investigation.
Well, you've got a clip of him. I know we were going
Right.
to do the clips in a different order, but since we're talking about, let's go ahead, Jen, let's cut to the clip of the new Horry County Police Chief discussing this ongoing investigation. Let's take a listen.
Today is the day just to, as I've spoken previously, to give you an update on our internal affairs investigation as that has been continuing, that I requested once discovering the news, the information of the recordings previously in this case. I've directed now an IA team. That team, we have 3 investigators that are dedicated every day to reviewing this case for any type of misconduct, policy violations that we may find on the part of the Horry County Police Department. Since I've been chief, I've directed that. We have discovered last week 7 additional videos that were improperly labeled. Those were reviewed and sent over to SLED as a continuation of the misconduct investigation, as well as our internal affairs investigation to conduct. So as I've stated before, as new updates become available, we will get that information to you to be transparent to the community and get that information out there. So that's the update I have for you in the case, and I'll be glad to take any questions you may have. Absolutely, great question. So I will say, and I'll go back to, again, once I became chief in October. This case happened in September of 2023. Since I've been chief, I've taken every action that I can personally to get the case reviewed, to look at it internally. And I can tell you in the community as well, they can have faith in our department. I hold our department to a very high standard, which I've said from the very beginning. Anyone that knows me and knows my career, I grew up here. I have honor, integrity, and I hold myself to an extremely high standard. My officers will be held to that standard. If they can't meet that standard, they can't work here. So to say that, I will say again that our agency is one of the best in the state, will continue to be one of the best in the state. And those folks that can't meet our standard won't work here. To the Spivey family, I will say again, like I've said before, any loss of life is unfortunate. Again, we will review the case. We'll do everything in our power to review and make sure things were handled properly. As far as the criminal investigation, that is out of Horry County Police hands. We do not have that. That is between the state attorney general and SLED. We are strictly looking at the internal affairs issue of it, as far as any type of policy violations or conduct that may be in violation.
Well, Jen, you were talking about it earlier, that SLED investigation into the Horry County Police Department. Based on what I've seen, I would be shocked if there were not misconduct charges against one or more officers of the Horry County Police Department for the way they mishandled this. But this is a critical caveat here. We got to talk about this. But there is evidence based on 911 calls that were published. Again, I don't know who else published them. We published them this week. More than 4 different 911 calls from this shooting, which certainly would seem to indicate that despite the botched investigation and the allegations of corruption by the Horry County Police Department, there may be a compelling stand your ground case here for these 2 individuals implicated in the wrongful death case. Jen, walk us through these 911 calls. Tell us a little bit about what sort of basis they provide for this shooting incident.
So when Callie and I initially began looking at this story, we took a step back, and our story came out quite a bit after everybody else's initial story. But we really wanted to look at the evidence as objectively as possible. We want to look at this case as much as we can. So she FOIA'd for the 911 calls that came in that day regarding what was going on between where Scott Spivey left the bar that day and where the shooting happened.
This was a lengthy chase. Again, this was through, 9-something miles? It was a lengthy chase through rural Horry County, ended about 2 miles south of the North Carolina border. But yeah, walk us through what some of these 911 calls revealed.
So there were 4 separate 911 calls. The first caller was a female. This was, before Weldon Boyd even called 911 to report what was happening. This female called, and her reporting of what was going on the road was absolutely fascinating. She was clearly in fear for her life, for others on the road, based on her observations of Scott Spivey's driving very erratically and waving a gun out of the window. So her call, I believe it was over 20 minutes in its entirety. She stayed on the phone with 911 right up until the shooting began.
She was on the call when the shooting took place.
Correct.
Let's take a listen to just a little bit of that call, Jen.
I'm on Highway 9 about to come up on Minuteman and Little Caesars right here in Long. There is a guy that is waving a gun in front of me trying to shoot at my car, and the other one's beside us. He's all over the road, and I have his license plate number.
Okay, he's waving the gun right now?
He's waving it out the window at everybody. I don't know if he's under the influence of anything, because he's all over the road. He just made one guy run off the road completely, and he's back on the road now.
Okay, ma'am. I'm here.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Of course. Just let me know if anything changes, okay?
I will. Thank you.
It's okay. Just take a deep breath, all right? You did a good job calling it in. That's brave.
Thank you. At first, whenever I first seen him coming up on the highway, when it very first started, I seen him right in my tail, and I was like, what in the world? Like, why don't he just go around me? And then he had pointed the gun at me, kind of tapped it on the, like that on his window. And as he was going through all the traffic, because he stayed right near, me and the other cars around, and he just kept waving it out the window, going on and off the road, made the guy that actually, I was telling the other lady about, that is in the white truck that I think had what he was shooting at. He made that guy run off the road. He had a trailer connected to the back of his truck. He made him run completely off the road. And as we're still, going down number 9, heading towards Morris, I would say, they pulled right here, going on Camp Swamp Highway, road, because I live back that way on Sandy Plains. So I'm coming home from work, and I see him go that way, and I already had got kind of fearful anyway, because, oh my God, he's turning down the same road as me, And so I was like, oh shit. Well, then I didn't see him jump out the car, but time I'm going to turn in, how the other lady heard me. I'm like, oh my God, he's shooting. I don't know if one of the bullets ricocheted and it hit my car, or if it got shot. But when I yelled that at her, well, not yelled at her, but yelled it out. I have no idea. I haven't got out my car and looked at it because my nerves are shot. But I'm nervous because I'm worried about the guy in the white truck because he shot his truck so many times.
I know.
And I just hope he is okay.
We're getting the paramedics and we're getting the police. The police are on scene. Again, just stay in your car. I know it's scary. Just focus on your breathing. We're getting him help.
Yes, ma'am.
So, Jen, that call and other 911 calls very clearly indicate that Scott Spivey driving erratically, allegedly running Weldon Boyd off the road, pulling the gun out, and Weldon Boyd on his 911 call clearly states on several occasions that if that continues, quote, we're going to have to shoot this guy. Now, here's the question I have, though, and I want to, again, bring in the fairness on all sides here. This was a chase that, again, Weldon Boyd was a key part of this chase. And again, if he just pulls off the road and lets this guy go, do we not end up where we end up? And
Right.
so I noticed in the wrongful death suit, there are repeated references to an illegal pursuit. And so, Jen, how does that play into what ultimately happened if the basis of that shootout was a pursuit that never should have happened and common sense dictates, hey, man, just pull your truck to the side of the road, let this guy go.
Right. Call 911, let them handle it. Yeah, I mean, do you absolutely think that was some very questionable decision making on his part? I don't think his passenger was very happy with how things turned out. I think there were some comments made on the 911 call by the passenger that indicated, why did you have to, why did you do this? And
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Why? I mean, was there any
right.
evidence that these two had a prior history, connection?
No, none that we have been able to find. Clearly, we're keeping that possibility open. I don't
You
want to
hesitated a little
assume.
bit there, Jen. I mean, what do we know here?
Well, I don't want to assume. I
You got the
honestly,
cookie jar
we have not.
face.
We haven't found any indication of that.
Okay.
But in investigations and lawsuits and cases like this, we don't have all of the information. We don't want to assume anything. But when you look at what we know about where the shooting occurred, Scott Spivey was standing outside of his vehicle holding a gun, and Weldon and his passenger were inside of their vehicle from all accounts.
Yeah.
Granted, how much can we trust in the investigation? I do not know, but there were clear bullet holes through the front windshield of the car.
Yeah.
So, we're looking at a situation where, the investigation was mishandled, absolutely mishandled. It was grossly mishandled. But does that mean the facts of the case change?
Yeah.
Was this shooting not justified under South Carolina's current statutes? I don't know yet.
Well, I've got to say, I appreciate the way that you dug into this, and Callie Lyons in our offices dug into this. Very fact-based, very narrative-focused, not taking one side or the other, because again, this is another one of those cases that has turned into a team sport, and that is just unfortunate. We certainly expect attorneys to be vigorous advocates for their clients as it relates to the filings in this case and pushing for the reopening of a criminal investigation. That is expected. That is something that attorneys should do. But those of us whose job it is to report on these stories, again, this is another one that just seems to devolve into whose team are we on, not where did the facts lead us. And that is unfortunate. But Jen, you guys have done a great job staying away from that sort of team mentality and just going where the facts and the evidence take us. I think that's one reason people come to FITSNews. But I want to move on, Jen. You mentioned earlier that there's another case that we were going to talk about in Horry County. And I want to get to that because it ties to what has been the biggest story FITSNews has covered over the last year. We celebrated a month ago the 1-year anniversary of this saga, the death of Micah Miller, the aspiring missionary worship leader at the Solid Rock Church in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, who died under unclear circumstances in Lumber River State Park in North Carolina on April the 27th of last year. Jim, we were the first to report on this story. It has exploded into an international saga. There's been all manner of speculation about this story. And I wanted to ask you, because John Paul Miller, Micah Miller's husband, pastor at Solid Rock, the guy whose bizarre announcement of his wife's death, in which he told his congregation to leave the church without talking about it, in which he tried to basically gaslight his late wife through that sermon announcement and through an obituary, which completely misrepresented the disastrous state of their marriage, due in large part, if court filings are to be believed, to his coercive control and his attempts to isolate, manipulate, and otherwise intimidate and terrorize his late wife, again, if those court filings are to be believed. But Jen, this is a guy who tried to control this narrative, and it just blew this story up, didn't it?
It did. And, I don't think this would be a story if John Paul Miller had not done what he did in the aftermath of Micah's death. So, I think his need to control what is being said, control how it's being said, started out his problems. And I think throughout this entire saga, through, the FBI doing executing a search warrant on his home. That's the better phrase for it. To the lawsuits filed against him, to the influx of lawsuits he filed against others, his need to control that narrative has not played out well for him.
Well, we're going to talk about those lawsuits in just a minute, but first I wanted to talk about the woman who has admitted in open court that she is his girlfriend, Susie Skinner, also from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Now, Susie was married to Chris Skinner, Jen, a wheelchair-bound paraplegic, paralyzed from the chest up, was in a very specially configured all-terrain wheelchair that was purchased through the donations of a lot of folks to help him enjoy life on the beach, to try to get the most out of life. This was a guy who had written books, was a motivational speaker, and yet we are told he drove his wheelchair into a pool at the development where they lived out of the blue one morning on Labor Day of 2021. Now, we've reviewed the footage of that incident, and it certainly does not appear to be what police initially said it was, which was a guy getting a little too close to the edge and just falling into the pool. It appeared certainly to be deliberate, either by him or, according to some, people controlling his chair. But it ended up with Chris Skinner drowning in that pool on Labor Day in 2021. And Jen, you spoke with Chris's sister, Tamara McDermott, and what she says is her final interview on this subject. She has spoken extensively about her late brother and what she believes happened to him. But Jen, set this clip up for us from your discussion with Tamara McDermott.
Yeah, Tamara is, she's absolutely wonderful. When I first started speaking with her, I was, surprised at just how even-keeled, intelligent, grounded she was in her approach. Her and her parents are both just looking for answers regarding Chris's death. They have always had questions. Those questions were, kind of at the back of their mind. They weren't comfortable with what had happened, what they were told. But in the aftermath of Micah Miller's death, those questions became very, very prominent. And I have to say, in the first month at looking at Micah's death, our first report was done May 5th. In between May 5th and when John Paul Miller's ex-wife, Allison Williams, filed her affidavit in early June, I spoke to a lot of people that knew Micah intimately, a lot of close friends, eventually speaking with her sisters and her family. And Chris Skinner's death in those early weeks was mentioned to me by many of them. You need to look at this. There's something wrong with it. And then when Allison Williams filed her affidavit and noted that in her affidavit, that is when I was like, oh, we really need to look at
Well,
this.
tell everybody what she said in that affidavit. It was incredibly damning.
Yeah, she said that John Paul Miller and Susie Skinner were having a relationship, and that Chris Skinner died in what was deemed an accident. And
but he had found out about it and confronted them.
Right.
Told
He had
John Paul,
confronted
stay away
them.
from my wife and my kids.
2 weeks prior to his death, he had confronted JP and said, "Stay away from my family." Tamara, in her interview with me, spoke about how, in the months leading up to his death, Chris had stopped going to that church. He did not like John Paul. He did not like the message that was delivered. And, there's a lot of things that we learned after Micah's death that made Chris's death something that I think should be looked at more closely. And it has been. The coroner in Horry County has reopened that investigation. She confirmed this week that investigation is still reopened. They are still looking into it. But, when you look at that video, it is 100% to me, in my opinion, doesn't align with what was reported by police.
When certainly
By the Myrtle
Tamara
Beach
didn't think
Police
so.
Department.
Let's hear her.
Right. Let's hear what Tamara had to say about that.
In the video, you see he lines up and he stops for a moment and then he goes quickly forward. And I think that leaves the question, who's in control of the wheelchair? Did Chris do that? We know this chair could be remotely controlled. That leaves open all kinds of possibilities, especially when you have someone who showed a fascination for a remote kind of situation. But it was no accident.
Yes, I think you guys are kind of saying what I've been saying on my events. And as you mentioned, Jen, I was, I feel like retaliated against and cyber bullied for trying to say that, just try to be honest. And that's what I saw. And that's what it looks like. It doesn't look like an accident to me.
So, Jim, we've got no proof at this point that Chris Skinner was killed. We've got no proof at this point that Micah Miller was killed, that her death was anything other than what authorities have insisted it was, a death by suicide. So let me ask you this question. Why is there still so much uncertainty surrounding these deaths?
Yeah, I don't know that at this point. Sometimes I wonder if we're ever going to know the truth, but you look at, from all accounts from Susie Skinner, Chris, or Susie and JP are now together publicly. Both their spouses died under suspicious circumstances. In the aftermath of Chris's death, there was a clear movement, based on what was told to investigators by Susie in the reports, to frame that as an accident. And that leaves a lot of questions. Tamara talked to a lot of people and witnessed in the months leading up to Chris Skinner's death that he wasn't getting the care that he required. As a paraplegic, he was not getting the care that he needed to stay healthy and stay safe. He wasn't, he had been admitted to the hospital for sores. He, was constantly hungry. It was not a good situation. And him confronting JP shortly before his death, I think,
well, and then there's
it should be investigated.
There's the police report where we read what Susie Skinner, upon arriving at the scene of her husband's death, informs those attempting to resuscitate him, hey, he's got a do not resuscitate order, which that was kind of a red flag for me. Again, I don't know, don't want to try to claim I'm inside her head for what she was thinking at that point in time, but certainly when you look at it in the context we're looking at it, it raises questions. Jen, I want to shift gears a little bit because we're talking about these deaths which continue to stoke suspicion, which continue to drive discussion. But there's also legal drama playing out in the courtrooms in Horry County regarding allegations of abuse leveled at John Paul Miller, leveled against his father, leveled against the religious institutions that made them very wealthy and influential men on the coast of South Carolina. But John Paul Miller, once again, seeking to seize control of the narrative, he has filed 2 countersuits against his anonymous accusers in those sex abuse cases, claiming in one case that he never met one of the victims, who has accused him of sexual abuse many, many years ago at one of these religious institutions that they operated. Jen, as you read through these court filings and sort of layer them against this ongoing federal investigation, which we hear is approaching a point of critical mass sooner rather than later, we're told. What do you see emerging as the main themes that folks should be looking for as this Micah Miller, John Paul Miller saga continues to roll on?
So, this countersuit, just like the last one, surprised, like he never met her, he says, and the lawsuit is basically filed to defame him, and it was malice. I mean, we're once again seeing John Paul trying to reshape the narrative through the legal system. It's not a good look.
Well, I don't want to take sides on this but let me just throw out from the perspective of John Paul Miller. I mean, you've got two individuals who are claiming to have had their memories of abuse, revived, come back to them after the saga of Micah Miller. Is that correct? I know in one case, one of the Jane Does who filed suit against him said that the coverage of Micah Miller, reminded her of what had happened to her many, many years ago. And so he's claiming, well, I never met this person. There's no evidence to support any of these allegations. And oh, by the way, he's challenging how did the people accusing me get to remain anonymous in this process? Is there something to be said when John Paul Miller makes these allegations that he's being targeted and being focused because he's viewed by many people as a diabolical individual, and rightfully so because of the Micah Miller court filings? Does he have a leg to stand on here, Jen, and pushing back a little bit?
My personal opinion, I don't believe he does. I'm not an attorney, though. I really don't. I think he's.
You think he's intimidating victims?
I really do, and it does seems to be his MO. And Tamara McDermott even mentioned that, and as she started becoming more vocal about her brother, that was immediately what happened. There were articles written by people that spoke with John Paul directly that were intended to discredit her, and even to her and an attorney she consulted with would be considered defamation. And that seems to be kind of how he handles things. But, I got a guy backed into a corner.
Right. Well, and again, I don't want to defend the guy. I think based on everything that we have learned in this case, and including conversations with individuals who are still under his thumb and subjected to his erratic behavior, according to them anyway, seems like a very dangerous individual, and certainly not defending him. But as we discussed in the Murdaugh segment, there is that component of justice, fairness, proving things. And so obviously we'll see how these civil cases play out. But
I mean, I have to say, I covering the story, I did actually get to know both of these Jane Does. I have heard their stories. I have spoken to them at length.
You believe them?
I found them very credible. They are good people. Their stories have never wavered. They're very traumatized, in my opinion. So, it's for the courts to decide at this point. But from my perspective, in speaking with both of these women, I found them very credible.
Well, one thing is for sure, the courts will be doing a lot of deciding as it relates to John Paul Miller, not only in the civil arena, but as these criminal charges, which, again, we are told sooner rather than later, those are in the works as it relates to John Paul Miller. We don't know exactly what he will be charged with. We still don't know exactly what the FBI was looking for when they went knocking on his door back in November of last year. But that investigation, according to our sources, again, has borne fruit, and charges against John Paul Miller certainly likely to be coming sooner rather than later, according to our sources familiar with the investigation. Jen Wood, you've done an amazing job on all of these stories. The Murdaugh story we discussed, the Scott Spivey story, and of course, the Micah Miller saga. Can't thank you and Kelly Lyons enough for your work. Folks, if you are just tuning into these three ongoing true crime dramas, FITSNews.com has covered them from the very beginning. Keep it tuned to our media outlet for the very latest on all of these unfolding sagas. So for our next segment, we are joined by the man, Andy Fancher, dropping bombs on badges gone bad all over the state. But the last few weeks, you have been uncorking arguably one of our biggest law enforcement corruption stories ever. In fact, the Harpootlian interview we talked about at the beginning of the show, we're talking to him earlier, and he even made a reference to it. I mean, this is on everybody's radar. The story of Spartanburg Sheriff Chuck Wright, focus of an ongoing multi-agency investigation. Right. Andy, what is the latest on the saga of Chuck Wright?
Sure. For recap on Chuck Wright, this is the 4-term sheriff of Spartanburg County, one of the largest departments and one of the largest counties in the state of South Carolina. I mean, Spartanburg County, it straddles the North Carolina line, anchored by Interstate 85, home to one of the largest inland ports in the country. This is no laughing matter, this county, neither the county nor what the sheriff is purportedly involved with. Now, we're uncovering a whole lot, and every time I come on this show, I encourage more and more people to reach out. And
they are.
They are, by the truckloads, by the shipping container full. But, just every testimony, whether it's significant or not, it does help paint this bigger picture of what the sheriff seems to be involved in. Now, whether or not I'll see it rise to a level of publishing within the next day or the next year, what I know about myself is I'm not going to let this one go, and we're just going to have to keep on going. This is one of those stories where the rabbit holes are unending. When you think you approach a brick wall, there's another person who points you in that direction, and then away you go. It is wild. It's wild.
So it has been over a month since Chuck Wright, on April Fool's Day,
of all days,
announced that he was taking a temporary leave of absence. Mm-hmm. He has not been seen at the Spartanburg Sheriff's Office since. There's been speculation about his whereabouts. We've been able to learn that his location is known to those investigating him, which right. I think is significant when we hear from sources with direct knowledge of the investigation. Yeah, we know where he is. Mm-hmm. When you hear something like that, what does that imply to you?
Well, that implies to me that his constituents still have a right to know where their sheriff is. Their handsomely paid sheriff. This is a fellow who's collecting approximately $4,000 a week. Wow. And you would think that their transparency issues that have been present for literally years would have woken some people up to it. But alas, we're not going to get hung up on perhaps the ignorance of the past, because we're in the present now, and people are talking. They're providing us with information, some providing us with receipts. So what does that tell us? It tells us that our report might have brought us to that little tidbit that you just shared, mm-hmm. because we were the only outlet. Well, hell, we're still the only outlet to talk about a federal grand jury being impaneled in Columbia, South Carolina. We're the only outlet to mention that at least 4 witnesses have testified before this federal grand jury. We spoke with one of them, and we've got some magnificent detail that I cannot wait to get into. But why are we the only outlets talking about this? I suppose that should be the question to your question is why?
Well, from the beginning, up there, he's had a lot of support from just rank and file members of the public, but he's got a lot of institutional support as well. The governor came out and said nice things about him. A lot of folks like this guy, Andy.
Well, on paper, he's hard not to like. I mean, we're talking about a incredibly Christian conservative sheriff who has posed alongside Trump more than once. I mean, he'll attend target practices with your kids. He'll go shooting. He'll pray with you. And I can't say that in listening to his old speeches, I don't agree with some of his philosophy and platform, but it's a sheriff in name only, I suppose. especially when you look into some of his extracurricular dealings, look into his alleged mismanagement, his alleged pill dependency. And we have heard from a lot of folks regarding that pill dependency too. And it's one thing to struggle with an addiction, of course, but to accuse people and blast them across socials and TV of things that you might be grappling with yourself, that, my friend, is a hypocrite.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because this alleged addiction is one of the many facets of this, again, multi-agency inquiry. The people you've talked to, Andy, who have either been spoken to by investigators, who have either appeared in front of the grand jury, what do we know about the scope of this investigation?
Sure. So it's worth noting that we don't know why the feds are in town. Folks who have been interviewed have noted agents from both the FBI and SLED, South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, so certainly reaching that multi-agency criteria. But as for what the agents are looking into, we were told by somebody who was both interviewed by agents from multiple agencies, as well as somebody who testified before the federal grand jury. They recall 4 things specifically that the investigators were interested in. And that was, of course, Chuck's alleged pill dependency. We had one person tell us that he had reached out to them multiple times, seeing if they could find pills. And this individual noted how uncomfortable that was, that the top law enforcement officer of the county was asking you to break the law. So we've got that. We've got questions surrounding his financial mismanagement. That's a large umbrella, and we could get into that more in a moment. But to mainstream media's credit, they have reported on his exorbitant amount of spending off of his county credit card. The other 2 things, the other 2 notes that folks who were interviewed relayed to us, is they asked about L.B. Watson, which we have discussed in the past. L.B. Watson, this is a blood relative of Chuck Wright, who holds the title of Code Enforcement Officer, although it remains unclear what exactly he does for the Sheriff's Department. We have been able to dig through both open source intelligence as well as deputies. We have confirmed that he was receiving a paycheck as early as 2007 in the $31,000 range, and at present, he seems to be pulling in approximately $51,000. But again, what exactly this code enforcement officer, who multiple witnesses have placed him with a badge and a gun on his hip, driving county-issued vehicles for years, remains unclear. And the final
He's
thing...
He's alleged to have some side hustles, isn't he?
He is alleged...
The sheriff is alleged to have some side hustles.
The sheriff is alleged to have been placed in the same room as L.B. Watson during some of these exciting meetings, which... Again, whether that will rise to a level of publishing in an hour or in a year, I'm not exactly sure on that, but we're digging.
But you were going through the litany of potential focuses of this investigation. There's also a police benevolent fund or sheriff's benevolent fund that has attracted the attention of the feds, and there was a resignation just recently. Tell us a little bit about this.
Sure,
fund.
And that would bring us to the 4th thing that the feds purportedly asked about, that this one individual recalls. And that would be, as you noted, the Sheriff's Office's Benevolence Fund, the Chaplain Benevolence Fund. This is a fund that's pretty much reserved for deputies going through hardships. We have spoken to folks who, in the past, they did receive financial aid from the Benevolence Fund. But in recent years, something interesting appears to have happened to this benevolence fund, which, while it has been promoted by Chuck on multiple occasions, you can go to the SCSO's Facebook page and you can see those videos, does not appear to fall under the purview of the Sheriff's Office. That's according to a Freedom of Information Act request denial to an individual who had FOIA'd in the past for some details regarding this account. So just emphasizing here, the SCSO Chaplain Benevolence Fund does not appear to fall under the purview of the Sheriff's Office. In recent years, requests as little as $100, we're told, by deputies, has been denied because this account was empty. And as for who holds the keys to this coffer, while we don't know everybody, we do know that one individual would be SCSO's longtime senior chaplain, the only paid chaplain in the Vortex, Amos Durham.
Mm-hmm.
He's a local pastor who has been photographed for years alongside Chuck at law enforcement memorial ceremonies, at his own swear-ins. We had first heard his name weeks prior to his resignation, which was this Monday. And I suppose our investigation is active and ongoing into that as well.
Well, let me ask you this question, Andy. As you dig into these rabbit holes and what you've just discussed here, I've been in on some of the conversations. You and I both know this is just the surface. I mean, what we're discussing on this show is literally just the surface of what has been shared with us about some of these alleged instances of misconduct, not just by Sheriff Wright, but allegedly others in his employ and in his networks. But I want to ask you this question because I recall years ago when we were just diving into the Murdaugh story, one of the first few months of that story, and we published a big report about some of the deeper potential connections between the Murdaugh empire and some unsavory individuals. I remember right before pressing some of the publish button on some of those stories, feeling a little bit of the hair stand up on the back of your neck, like, ugh, you know, these are some bad dudes. This is some bad stuff. This is maybe getting into the area where consequences. And so I wanted to ask you, you've busted dozens of corrupt cops here in this state. You've published exclusive reports that led to investigations. You've reported on those investigations. You've been holding the Criminal Justice Academy accountable for continuing to let some of these folks slip through the cracks. But this, to me, seems the first time that you've kind of been like, wow, this is one that, you know, I'm biting off a lot. Let me ask you this question. As you've been digging on this story, the potential that you see here for those sort of deeper Murdaugh level connections, are they there?
You know me, Will. I don't like to be sensational. I like to err on the side of caution and fact. And I suppose to answer your question, all I can say is absolutely. I can't say it is not concerning. I mean, when we first got started, and by that, I mean, when Chuck Wright first deputized his son, which led to the beginning of the end here in July of 2024, we were warned. And admittedly, we're warned a lot, especially in speaking on law enforcement. I mean, just this week, we published 3 unrelated articles to police negligence out of Sumter, Lexington County, and that Lexington County one dripped into Kershaw County, and we've got plenty more on that online at FITSNews. But after so many people were telling us to watch out, I suppose my concerns finally came to peak when a former deputy who reached out with information, mind you, said, Chuck Wright will tap on your shoulders in ways that you have no idea, in ways that you will never see coming.
Wow.
They said that we are poking the bear and that we better watch out. I can't say that line doesn't keep me up at night, but like I said right before we started taping, I don't have to jump out of airplanes to get a thrill.
Well, man, you've been doing amazing work following this down, and I got to credit you for going where the facts lead. There's a ton of stuff that folks without your sense of integrity on doing this stuff would have just plastered out there for clicks already weeks ago. But you have been sticking to what we know, what credible sources have told us, what our sources that are directly tied to this investigation have confirmed. We've been doing multiple channels. In fact, I remember just this weekend discussing one of these stories and laying out sort of, hey, let's make sure we got this triple nailed down before we go to, and I respect that, man. I mean, that's what we need, and that's kind of what these investigations often lack in the coverage. But Andy, you've done great work here. As we look for developments on the Chuck Wright story as it unfolds into this coming week, where do you think it's headed? We've heard reports that perhaps Chuck Wright might be considering coming back to work after this leave of absence. Does he owe the citizens of Spartanburg an explanation for what's going on here?
Well, It's funny. There have been conversations of a betting pool, right? What's going to happen? Are we going to have the Jimmy Swaggart "I have sinned against you" press conference, or what? Um, I have no clue what's going to happen next. I mean, when we started going down the rabbit hole, I never would have expected to see what I have seen so far. And even then, I feel we've hardly scratched the surface of this thing. How deep does it go? It makes the hair on my arm stand up right now talking about it. And believe you me, I hate to be so vague.
Yeah.
You're, of course, surprised on what we've been looking into. And this entails trips all across the state, getting
Yeah,
receipts
but for
from...
anybody looking to put a bullet in Andy's back, I don't know everything, so you don't have to.
Okay, okay, yeah.
No, you're right. We know we've been consulting on this, and Jen Wood in our office has been
Mhm.
digging on a lot of this stuff, pulling info, and it's been amazing to watch it all come together. And the other thing I think it's important to note is that we do give law enforcement and prosecutors a lot of grief on this site. We do call them out, but it feels like in this case, Andy, that they're on top of it. It feels like at the very least they are serious about getting to the bottom of the allegations against Chuck Wright. Would you agree with that?
Well, if the sitting sheriff who's under a multi-agency probe is accepting visitors at his home and is considering a return amid a multi-agency probe, it makes me wonder, is this going to turn into one of those multi-year investigations that might eventually fizzle out? I know in Texas, my attorney general, Ken Paxton, I mean, he's been under investigation since 2015. And he has won every re-election since, not even participating in the debates. So I don't know if we're going to see Just Us served next week or if it'll ever happen. I'm, of course, a pessimist at heart, so don't listen to me.
I'm picking up on that.
Well, I mean, when you see just how corrupt law enforcement is in this state, it's not rumored at this point. I mean, I think with our multiple filings on any given week, it shows that there is a law enforcement problem in this state. And I'll introduce the painkiller here. No, Chuck, not that kind of painkiller. But I'll introduce the painkiller here, which is that we cannot expose that corruption without good cops.
That's
right?
true.
It is good cops cutting the thick blue line and telling us where we need to go. They're
right.
doing that in Spartanburg. They did that in Kershaw County this week.
There's a lot of them.
There are a lot of men and women in the Spartanburg vortex, business owners, members of the law enforcement community and adjacent, who really are sticking their neck out to see justice finally served in Spartanburg County. Whatever that may look like at the end of the day, all I know is that everybody in South Carolina should be commending these individuals for stepping up to the plate, risking their careers, risking not only their lives, but their families' lives to just turn on a light in a room that's exposing a lot of cockroaches.
Andy, amazing work, man. Keep it up, brother. So it was a cacophonous end to the 2025 legislative session in the state of South Carolina. Organized thievery added again with the Republican supermajority. A lot of money was spent. A lot of bills were passed. Will any of it make your life any better? Probably not. In fact, if you look at the numbers over the last few years, odds are actions coming out of that chamber and that building have made your life worse. But I'm joined by Dylan Nolan. We're going to recap. At least there was some drama we could report on. There's not a lot of progress happening. There's not a lot of positive outcomes. But, at least these guys are good for some soap opera content. And Dylan, this past week, the big soap opera was revolving around the issue of abortion. And this is a hugely controversial issue. It has been ever since the United States Supreme Court returned this issue to the states to decide. In South Carolina, that has been a 3-year process going back and forth with our state Supreme Court over specific parameters. We thought the issue was resolved with a 6-week ban. Essentially, abortion's legal up to 6 weeks with exemptions for rape, for incest, fetal anomalies. This was generally believed to be the compromise that everyone was going to live with. Turns out not everyone wanted to live with that compromise. There have been some very aggressive pro-life advocates pushing for a complete ban of abortion, one which they claim would save the lives of more than 2,400 preborn children each year here in South Carolina. Now, this fight, obviously, there are folks with passionate beliefs on all sides. We're not going to really address the merits of the fight. We're dealing with the fallout from it. We're dealing with the politics. We're dealing with what we saw at the State House this week, literally the Republican caucus tearing apart at the seams over this issue. Dylan, let me ask you this. Republicans have already kicked the fiscal conservatives out of their caucus. They've shown the Freedom Caucus folks the door. Now they have openly declared war on the Family Caucus, the leader of the Family Caucus. So now they're going after the social conservatives. At some point, what is a Republican majority in South Carolina? If you don't have the fiscal conservatives, you don't have the social conservatives, who's left?
Well, you could say the business community would be left, but I would argue that the tort reform issue has not been resolved in a way that that community is satisfied with either. So while the House GOP majority came in with a very strong coalition at the beginning of this session, they're leaving with one that, as you say, definitely has some fault lines which were not there at the beginning.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about how the pro-life movement and the abortion issue has really exposed these fault lines, because as we mentioned, this was an issue folks thought was done. They thought we weren't going to talk about it. But you have multiple leaders in the South Carolina House of Representatives, Speaker Merle Smith, Majority Leader Davey Hyatt. These are powerful leaders in this chamber. These are the folks who get things done, who move bills through. They sponsored this total abortion ban. They put their names on this bill. They signified to all these pro-life advocates, hey, we're with you. We're going to move this bill. But then when it came time to move it, they said, no, let's just be happy with what we've got already. We're not going to move it. That's when all hell broke loose.
Yeah, if you're looking at a bill and you see the Senate presidents on it, or you see the House speakers on it, or the majority leader, if you see these names on a bill, typically you're like, this is good as gold. This is going to fly through the process. There's going to be no procedural hurdles. Because in theory, if the leadership wants a bill to move rapidly, that thing can fly to the governor's desk in a matter of hours. However, if it's a bill that's proposed by some low-level lawmaker who doesn't have the influence, it's lucky if it even gets a committee hearing, which you need to get a subcommittee hearing, a full committee hearing, then it goes to the full body. So there's usually a long and arduous process. But as you say, it's strange for a bill that ostensibly has been rubber-stamped by the leadership to get stuck in the quagmires of not being able to get out of committee. And it shows you that their true intention was to take credit for introducing this legislation, but not to actually do anything to advance it.
Well, and then they were called out on that. We've been talking a lot about this group, Students for Life Action. This is a group that was very involved in South Carolina partisan primary races last year. In fact, they were instrumental in taking out 3 state senators who were deemed to be insufficiently loyal to the pro-life cause. Now they are very active in the House, showing up at leaders' churches, in fact, educating parishioners at these leaders' churches about their views on abortion and their ostensible lack of support for the pro-life cause. That pissed the leaders off something fierce, didn't it, Dylan?
It did. I mean, they made members choose. The House Family Caucus this session had grown rapidly. This was, it swelled to, I think, at some point, more than 40 members. Yeah. But they lost 29. Leadership basically said, you're either going to be standing with them or standing with us. And the reality is that while this Students for Life Action Group has a lot of money, they have the willingness and ability to put people in your district and go knock doors. Leadership also has a lot of money and also has that ability. So if you're, a low-level legislator, I can understand why a lot of these guys are not going to put their political lives in the hands of the Students for Life Action. That being said, Rep. McCravey, the head of the Family Caucus, he stood by him, and he actually invited them to come down to the State House this week where they were delivering fire and brimstone.
Yeah, but we've got a clip from that. Let's listen to some of the fire and brimstone. This is Kristen Hawkins, who is the president of Students for Life Action. Let's hear what she had to say about these Republican leaders in the South Carolina House of Representatives.
The pro-life generation isn't going to fall for this. We're not going to fall for politics as usual. This is now a national issue. Now the national pro-life movement is concerned about what is happening here at the South Carolina State House. Why self-proclaimed GOP leaders are trying to kick a member out of the GOP caucus for fulfilling the platform of the GOP, which is to end the violence of abortion.
Well, Dylan, it's not just abortion. We see this on a lot of issues. There's the performative as you mentioned, introduction of these bills to great fanfare and press conferences, and these guys get their names in the paper as being for something or against something. But when it comes time to actually move it, I mean, say what you will about Kristen, her issue, her tactics, she's calling out a very fundamental problem with the Republican supermajority, is she not?
This group, they've shown in the past that they mean business, and who knows what negotiations will happen. For folks that aren't aware, this week is the end. The legislators will leave Columbia, so there will now be months where they are between sessions. Something could get brokered between now and then that means that there will be no bloodshed in the primaries, meaning that they might get an agreement from leadership to actually advance this bill, which would, of course, mean that the next session would be spent doing what we did previously, which is expending 80% of the time on debating abortion again, which is why leadership did not want to raise this issue again. But they could get what they want, or leadership could do what they've shown they did in the past with the Freedom Caucus, which has said, you want to fight? Let's fight.
Yeah.
And we saw how well that worked out for them with the Freedom Caucus.
So, Dylan, I want to put this in a little bit of context. We've been talking about the State House and the drama that's been unfolding there. I want to zoom the lens back a little bit on the Capitol complex and go over to the South Carolina Administrative Law Court. Now, this is not a place where a lot of news is broken. I mean, there's significant cases that go through there, but it's not often that the press streams over from the State House to cover what's going on in this small little corner in one of these dim, dingy bureaucrat buildings. But this week, a very high-profile battle was unfolding in that court involving Rahm Reddy. Now, we have covered Rahm Reddy and the Doge SC movement extensively here, but Reddy this week represented himself in front of a horde of lawyers from both the South Carolina Department of Environmental Services and the Coastal Conservation League, both of which are attempting to enforce a massive six-figure fine against Reddy for building a seawall on his own property on the Isle of Palms. Now, this has been a case that some say has inspired Reddy's political advocacy, but I got to tell you, Dylan, I've seen a lot in South Carolina courtrooms in the decades that I've been covering this, and even in the years that we've been doing this together. We've been in a lot of courts and a lot of settings. We've seen a lot of amazing lawyering. I don't think I've ever seen anything like the clinic that Rahm Reddy put on in this courtroom. For those of you who hadn't followed this case, this is a man who fired his team of lawyers, basically saying they were ripping him off and trying to cut deals with the government, and said, I'm going to do this myself. So he and his wife, Renee Reddy, literally standing up to this room full of attorneys and bureaucrats and administrators for the Department of Environmental Services and the Coastal Conservation League. He has been running circles around these folks, Dylan. It has been amazing to watch. Winning objections, scoring points against their witnesses. I don't know if he's going to win this case, but this guy has put on a masterclass in citizen advocacy. But I want to talk to you about the political implications. Reddy has made it clear that he is going after lawmakers who have stood against him and other citizens trying to protect property rights and stood with those Department of Environmental Services bureaucrats. He's made it very clear he is targeting some of those lawmakers. He's gotten into some tiffs with a few of them on social media. They've been very aggressively calling him out. We look at that pro-life fight. We look at the business community being pissed off about tort reform. And then we look at a guy like Rahm Reddy looking to drop plenty of money on some of these districts. What sort of campaign concoction are we brewing here, Dylan? I mean, this could be, you mentioned maybe there are compromises and there won't be blood, but it's looking like a lot of forces are going to be involved in this upcoming election.
There's certainly a lot of folks who are going to be looking to put political pressure on these House reps who have to all fight for re-election every cycle. That being said, there is a mitigating factor, and that's that this will be a midterm year. Your strongest year, if you're going for Republican primaries, is going to be your election year. So these off years, both at the primary and at the general, mean that it's going to be more difficult to pick up for Republicans a seat that is a purple seat or a seat that's a blue seat that's right on the edge. But it also means that there's going to be less overall political involvement. That being said, we do have a perfect storm here of multiple interest groups that I think are going to be dropping cash and trying to flip some seats.
Yeah, and as we've noted on this show many times here in South Carolina, given just the way that the legislative districts have been structured, the borders, the political boundaries, the fights for these seats.
It's all in the primary.
All in the Republican primary, and in the handful of Democrat seats in the Democrat primary. That is where the battle is won or lost. There are very few competitive elections in the general election in November.
You can usually count it on one hand.
Yeah, if that. And in fact, in most cases, in years past, a lot of these lawmakers just run for years and years with no opponents, whether it's in the primary or the general. That ship has sailed, Dylan. People are being challenged now. Is that good
Yeah.
for the process?
I think it's a great thing for the process just because it's going to make folks think a lot more when they cast a vote. Is this going to be used against me? Now, unfortunately, sometimes votes are kind of taken out of context to hit people on things that they shouldn't be hit for. But I think on balance, having somebody come in and hold you accountable, I mean, just think, how well would you do at your job if you knew that nobody would ever come in to replace you if you performed poorly? If I was just an unfireable employee, I don't know how motivated I would be to continue showing up and doing the best work I possibly can every single day.
No, that's true. As we look at this cycle, though, and one of the things that's going to play a big role in it, obviously, bread and butter issues, taxes and spending. Republicans were humiliated this year when they rolled out their tax plan. It was supposed to be a massive tax cut, biggest tax cut in South Carolina history. It ended up being a $1 billion tax hike on middle income earners, which forced them to go back to the drawing board. They came out with an amended plan this past week. It was a $400 million tax cut, so higher than what they originally proposed. That's obviously a good thing, putting some more money back in people's pockets. But Dylan, it was a struggle all year for these Republican leaders. They seem to be playing defense. And I got to be honest, even though the Freedom Caucus only has about 15, 16, 17 members, I don't know the exact number, those guys have been driving the narrative.
They have, and it's remarkable. Obviously, we were the first outlet to report that their former leader, R.J. May's house, was raided by federal authorities. May still is yet to be charged. He still shows up to the General Assembly and votes. However, he's no longer caucusing with the Freedom Caucus. He's just kind of out on his own.
Well, let's be clear. This was not any federal raid. This is over child porn, CSAM. I mean,
Yes,
this is like the worst thing you
kind
can
of
imagine.
federal raid that one could have on their house, yes. So, yeah, there's been no official action taken by law enforcement. They have gotten approval from a federal judge to continue examining evidence, which means that they must have demonstrated something to that judge to make them grant that order. But you come into this session and you see the guy who is both in the chamber, but more importantly, even out of the chamber, politically leading this group, get eliminated. And you think, okay, these guys are on the back foot. And for a couple of weeks, they seriously were on the back foot. However, they just kind of waited. They just kind of waited for their opponents to screw up.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't even think they ever really went on the offensive. I think that the House GOP caucus shot themselves in the foot.
They really did. And it was interesting. We pointed out R.J. May, you mentioned his role as a leader of the Freedom Caucus. Not only that, this was a guy, he's a campaign consultant.
This is what I mean. His role off of the floor is what is really important.
He got a lot of them elected.
He's the one who comes out there and actually wields the power. I mean, you, in politics, have power if you can make somebody lose their job. And the reality was that as a skilled campaign operative, he could go into these districts where we were just talking about, where for 20 years somebody has run unopposed, and make them fear for their political life. And having somebody like that in your corner for the Freedom Caucus was what allowed them to operate from a position of strength that was not reflected by the numbers that they have in their in the chamber.
Let's talk a little bit about those numbers, because obviously it's amazing that this group has been able to re-seize the initiative with regard to framing the debate in South Carolina. There's no doubt these guys are driving the debate.
Even if their bills never get heard at committee, even if they're assigned to the worst positions, they are still having an outsized role in deciding what goes on at the State House.
Absolutely. And here's my question, though. What does it take for that group, 16, 17, however many we want to say, what does it take for that group to actually begin to influence policy? Certainly they're driving the narrative, they're framing these issues, they are repeatedly embarrassing these Republicans who want to have their cake and eat it too. But what is it going to take for that group of lawmakers to wield actual power?
I mean, I think they're doing it in kind of an outside way right now, in that their best bills all get reintroduced by members who the mainstream GOP caucus feels okay with advancing their bill. And I'm not going to crap on these members who are reintroducing their bills, because frankly, they're governing in the way that if you're somebody who likes the Freedom Caucus, you're okay, yeah, copy their bill, whatever it takes to get it across the finish line. If you're not somebody who's playing teams here, which 99% of regular voters don't really care whether it's getting across the line from a Freedom Caucus member or a House GOP member if it's going to result in more money in their pocket at the end of the day or whatever the desired political outcome is. They're happy to see it happen. But I think that that is going to be what will allow these Freedom Caucus ideas to move in the State House, because the reality is they're popular with the primary voters. I don't think we're ever going to see House leadership give them the satisfaction of actually advancing their bills, but that might allow one of their underlings to copy them and move it.
Interesting. And again, it's not just House members that are going to face voters in 2026. We have got Republican primary elections for all of the statewide offices in South Carolina, including governor. And I want to ask you this, Dylan. We've been talking a little bit about all these forces that are going to play in these legislative races, and can they get maybe 8, maybe 10 more people to join that little group of Freedom Caucus members, and maybe get a third of that chamber where they could potentially sustain gubernatorial vetoes or uphold gubernatorial vetoes of bad laws. Let me ask you this question. Who would they see, and who do you see as the person most likely to be wielding that gubernatorial pen? Because we've got some big names running for governor. Attorney General Alan Wilson, Congresswoman Nancy Mace, Lieutenant Governor Pamela Yvette, Congressman Ralph Norman is considering a bid. These are some heavy hitters. But let me ask you this question. We also talked earlier about Rom Reddy. There are discussions that he might jump into this race and potentially throw a sizable amount of his fortune into winning it. Who do you see potentially holding that pen, Dylan? And let me ask you this as a follow-up. Who do you think should be holding that pen?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to answer the latter portion of that. Thank you for trying to set me up with that absolutely disastrous question. Who is likely to hold the pen? Right now, I think Alan Wilson, Nancy Mace are most likely to. I think Nancy is more likely to be the person holding the pen that the Freedom Caucus aligned voter would probably appreciate. I think Alan's closer to the mainstream of the state's GOP. Look at Ralph Norman. I think that he would obviously be closer to the Freedom Caucus values than the mainstream. You look at Pam Yvette, I'm going to say that she would be very close to the mainstream, although that she keeps telling everybody that she's going to get the MAGA Donald Trump endorsement. But certainly everybody is still on their toes about an outside entrant with a lot of cash dropping in, and that certainly could be Rom Reddy. I think he needs to make his decision as to whether he believes that he is better served backing one of these candidates that already has a lot of name recognition, because while he has a lot of money, I don't think many people outside of the political sphere, which is not representative of the average primary voter, know who he is. So he would have to spend a lot of money just to get on people's radar, compared to somebody like Alan Wilson, who's been in the news headlines every day for the last 12 years.
Yeah, and who has been working those political operatives and networks for years.
Certainly. I mean, Nancy Mace freaking lives on Fox News these days. So that's an uphill climb as far as name recognition goes.
I will tell you this, though, man. If that guy knows electoral politics and can pick electoral politics up the way that he's picked up environmental law, I'm telling you, I have not seen anything like...
I mean, I think it was remarkable. I watch guys go into court all the time on YouTube, pro se defendants, pro se meaning coming in without an attorney advising you. And they just get absolutely clowned on. They are horrific. I mean, imagine it's like you're going to play an extremely complex game with thousands of rules that are unique to the game, and you come in as somebody who this is like your first game and you're winning. It's shocking that he is not getting the floor wiped with him in court, and it is definitely an example of how he clearly has a mind that does not operate like your average person's.
He's thinking outside the box, and that could be exactly what the 2026 gubernatorial race needs. We're going to have to see how it unfolds. But Dylan, I think you said it right, that potential for a outside of the typical universe political
the dark horse candidate.
Somebody who comes in with their ability to self-fund, with that kind of...
And I'll tell you what, he's definitely a compelling speaker. Having heard him in person in court and gotten to speak with him in the hallway, he is the kind of person who, if you get him in front of a crowd, I think that he could most definitely move their hearts.
Oh, yeah. Does not hold back, impassioned, eloquent, and I think coming at it from, again, a position of, hey, these people came and took from me, my private property. I'm standing up for it. Most people can't do what he can do. And so I think the fact he's made it more about, again, this broader issue of the government taking
Well, and I think it's kind of this appeal that Donald Trump had when he was on the primary stage. Look in 2015. He's on there with a bunch of career politicians who really, in their lives, have done diddly squat other than government positions where, they've weaseled their way in and they get to rule over our lives. A guy like Donald Trump, a guy like Rahm, they've built fortunes on their own, and they can go on the debate stage and say, I've employed X thousands of people. I've made X millions of dollars. What have you done? Really, what have you done? And that's a question that most politicians can't answer well.
Yeah, and also how amazing is it that somebody like Trump, and now we're seeing in South Carolina somebody like Reddy, is able to seize that populist mantle, because those guys are the easiest guys to be attacked as rich, out of touch, elite, and yet they come off like, hey, I'm doing this for you.
Because they're selling the American dream, especially a guy like Rahm.
Yeah, no doubt. It's going to be a fascinating year, Dylan. We've been tracking these races, tracking these issues. The interplay just continues to fascinate me. But as we approach the next cycle, FITSNews.com has been at the front line of each one of these debates. We've been tracking each one of these races as they start to unfold. So be sure to go to our website, FITSNews.com, to get up to speed on the very latest on South Carolina politics, not only in the legislature, but on the campaign trail as we start to see these issues impact the political world here in the Palmetto State. All right, folks, that is a wrap for this week's edition. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to another episode of The Week in Review. As I mentioned, these are just a few of the stories we covered on FITSNews.com, so please check the website out for all of our coverage. And again, if this is the sort of independent, unapologetic, unbiased coverage that you value, please take time to subscribe. Your subscriptions drive everything we do. The lights, the cameras, the action, all of it empowered by your support. So please, if you haven't already, subscribe to FITSNews.com today.